Hey everybody, and welcome to a new video. Do you run into a problem taking photos where part of the image is in focus, like the background, but the foreground is out of focus? So you focus on the foreground to get that in focus, and the background is out of focus. A few videos back, I showed you how to combine several images of different brightnesses in a technique called exposure bracketing. In this video, I'm going to walk you through a solution to your problem of parts of your image not being in focus by combining several images in a technique called focus stacking. When to know you need to use it, how to do it, some handy tricks, and how to process those photos too. My name is Simon D'Entremont and I'm a professional nature and wildlife photographer living in Eastern Canada. I make weekly videos giving you photo tips or taking you behind the scenes for nature photography. Subscribe if you want to see more. Okay, let's get into focus stacking by first understanding what's going on here. The problem we're trying to solve is that having different parts of the image all in focus at once can be a challenge in certain situations. This can happen in landscape photography or even macro photography up really close. In landscape photography, we often have a problem of needing a very deep depth of field. That is, we want the whole scene to be in focus. This is usually accomplished by stopping down the lens, that is, making the aperture smaller by setting a large f number like f8 or f11. This gives us a large depth of field, hopefully enough to get the whole scene in focus. By the way, we get the maximum benefit of a deep depth of field by focusing the lens at a point 1/3 to halfway into the scene. This improves the odds that what's in front and behind the focus point are in sharp focus. There are two weaknesses to this plan though. One is that we can't make the aperture smaller indefinitely to get an even deeper depth of field. At very high f numbers, that is small apertures, we get an effect called diffraction, caused by the bending of light, which makes images soft at very large f numbers like f16. So there's a practical limit to how deep we can make the depth of field using choices in apertures. Secondly is another and maybe more common problem. Parts of the image that are very close to the camera aren't in focus. There are two reasons that this is a problem, and they seem to be conspiring against photographers. First, the closer something is to the camera, the farther away it is from the focus point somewhere in the middle of your scene at the 1/3 or halfway mark. Secondly, if you try and focus on this foreground object to get it in focus, the background is even more likely to be out of focus because the closer you are to something, the thinner the depth of field is. So if we focus on the foreground, the background isn't in focus. And if we focus on the background, the foreground isn't in focus. What do we do? In focus stacking, we take 2 or 3 photos, one focused on the background and one in the foreground and an extra one in the middle if needed, and combine them in software using the best parts of each image, the in focus parts. Now, when do we know if we need this? There's a few techniques you can use. One is the eyeball method, which is just to take a photo of the scene, focused on the 1/3 point in your scene, and see if the closest foreground element and the furthest background element are still in focus. The foreground is likely where the problem will show up. If out of focus, you'll need to look at different options. The second technique is the scientific approach. This is done by knowing what the hyperfocal distance is of your lens and chosen aperture. This is the distance at which everything beyond this point can be brought into focus. This comes from the fact that the farther your focus point from the camera, the deeper the depth of field gets. So the farther your focus point gets, the broader slice of the scene that you get into focus. It follows then that there's a distance at which everything to infinity will be in focus. Turns out at that point, everything starting halfway to that point to infinity will be in focus too. So if you can determine the hyperfocal distance for your lens and aperture, you can determine the distance at which, if you focus at that point, everything halfway to that distance and farther are always in focus. Kind of a foolproof in-focus distance. Using the hyperfocal table of the photography app PhotoPills, a 20mm lens on a full-frame camera shot at f9 will have a hyperfocal distance of 1.5 meters. So anything half of that, at 0.75 meters or 2.5 feet, is also in focus. Note that at the same 20mm but f2.8, much wider open aperture, the hyperfocal distance grows to 5 meters. Or the same f9 and a 35mm lens is also 5 meters. So this ability to have really close subjects in focus even at infinity is a feature of very short focal lengths combined with very small apertures, which is often what we use in landscape photography. I use this to my advantage in Milky Way photography, where I use a very wide angle lens with a very wide aperture. Even this church 20 meters away is in focus when I'm focused at infinity on the stars. Okay, so now you know why we have a problem with getting everything in focus, and we know how to figure out if we have a problem or not. What do we do in the field when our foreground elements aren't in focus? There are a few options to consider without stacking. First, you can increase the depth of field with a smaller aperture. Try increasing to f11 or f13. Note that your lens may get less sharp due to diffraction. At these small apertures, your shutter speed may be very low, so plan on using a tripod. Secondly, you can back up from your foreground element, and since we know that being farther away will make deeper depths of field, you may get it in focus. But note that making the foreground element smaller in your frame may mess up your planned composition and photo. Third, we can decide we don't want the whole scene in focus. I personally love having foreground elements out of focus. I do this all the time in my wildlife photography. It adds some nice depth that is artistic in its own way, which is sometimes better than technical accuracy or perfection. And fourth, we can look at focus stacking. So we set up our shot and composition just like we're going to shoot it all in one shot. Now move your focus point without moving the camera to the rear of the scene, likely around infinity or the horizon or something very far away. Take a shot. Then maybe the center of the scene, take a shot. Then a foreground element, take a shot. If you have a DSLR camera set on live view with a touchscreen or a mirrorless camera, you might do this by placing the focus point by touching the rear LCD, which is pretty handy. By the way, follow me on Instagram for more tips and sign up to my email list to get my free guide on shooting in backlit situations. Link below. Note that some cameras like my Canon R5 can do focus stacking in camera. You select the near point and the far point and the number of images, and the camera will fire off those images for you, adjusting the focus a bit for every shot to make sure the whole scene or subject is covered. Now, if you look at these photos, the one focused on the background has a foreground that isn't sharp, and the one focused on the foreground has a background that isn't sharp. To combine these into one image, we need a program that can combine several images by selecting and only using the parts of the image that are in focus. Photoshop can do this, but I'm going to start here in Lightroom Classic, where many Photoshop users might begin. We select our three images by clicking on the first, then hit Shift, and then the last image. With all three selected, we right-click, Edit in, Open as Layers in Photoshop. Now in Photoshop, we then select all the images that are to be stacked. We then hit Edit, Auto Align Layers. This will make sure the images are lined up in case there was some movement like your tripod sinking into the sand. Or some lenses may change the size of the image as focus changes, something called focus breathing. Then hit Edit, Auto Blend Layers, then hit Stack Images. Photoshop will then take the in-focus parts of each image and put them together into one photo by creating masks for each of the separate photos. You can see the mask that Photoshop used to selectively block out parts of the images that weren't in focus and choose the parts that are. So for this foreground image, only this section was selected, then the midground, then the background. Those three shots are now combined into one image. If we check the whole combined image, we can see that the foreground, the midground, and the background are all in focus. Excellent. Now I can hit save and it will send me back to Lightroom. I then do some processing to taste and voila, a landscape shot that's all in focus, including something up close. If you thought this video deserving, give it a like and YouTube will share it with even more photographers, helping them tackle out of focus images. And I hope that you can use these tips the next time you go out to get your own unique and amazing photos. I know you can do it.